The Bloody Benders were a family of serial killers who owned an inn and small general store in Labette County of southeastern Kansas from 1871 to 1873. The family consisted of John Bender, his wife, Elvira Bender, son, John, Jr., and daughter, Kate, while Bender mythology holds that John Jr. and Kate were brother and sister. Contemporary newspapers reported that several of the Benders' neighbors had stated that they claimed to be married, possibly a common-law marriage. They are believed to have killed at least a dozen travelers before their crimes were discovered and the family fled, with their fate uncertain. Much folklore and legend surrounds the Benders, making it difficult to separate fact from fiction. Background. Following the American Civil War, the United States government moved the Osage Indians from Labette County, Kansas to a new Indian territory located in what would eventually be Oklahoma. The newly vacant land was then made available to homesteaders. In October 1870, 5 families of spiritualists settled in and around Osage Township of western Labette County, approximately 7 miles northeast of where Cherryvale would be established 7 months later. One of the families was John Bender, Sr., and John Bender, Jr., who registered 160 acres of land located adjacent to the Great Osage Trail, which was then the only open road for traveling further west. After a cabin, a barn with corral, and a well were built. In the fall of 1871, Elvira Bender and her daughter, Kate, arrived, and the cabin was divided into 2 rooms by a canvas wagon cover. The Benders used the smaller room at the rear for living quarters, while the front room was converted into a general store where a few dry goods were sold. The front section also contained the kitchen and dining table, where travelers could stop for a meal or even spend the night. Elvira and Kate Bender also planted a 2-acre vegetable garden and apple orchard north of the cabin. Bender family. John, Pa, Bender, Sr., was around 60 years old and spoke very little English. When he did speak it, it was so guttural that it was usually unintelligible. According to the May 23, 1873 edition of the Emporia News, he was identified with the name of William Bender. Elvira Bender, who also allegedly spoke very little English, was 55 years of age and was so unfriendly that her neighbors took to calling her a she-devil. John Bender, Jr., was around 25 years old, handsome with auburn hair and mustache, and spoke English fluently but with a German accent. John was prone to laughing aimlessly, which led many to consider him a half-wit. Kate Bender, who was around 23, was cultivated and attractive and spoke English well with very little accent. A self-proclaimed healer and psychic, she distributed flyers advertising her supernatural powers and her ability to cure illnesses. She also conducted seances and gave lectures on spiritualism, for which she gained notoriety for advocating free love. Kate's popularity became a large attraction for the Benders Inn. Although the elder Benders kept to themselves, Kate and her brother regularly attended Sunday school in nearby Harmony Grove. The Benders were widely believed to be German immigrants. Only the male Benders, however, were born overseas, and they were not actually a family. No documentation or definitive proof of their relationships to one another or where they were born has ever been found. Pa Bender was from either Germany or the Netherlands and is believed by some to have been born John Flickinger, unproven. According to contemporary newspapers, Elvira Bender was born Elvira Hillmark, often misreported as Make, in the Adirondack Mountains. She married Simon Mark, with whom she claimed to have had 12 children. Later she married William Stephen Griffith and was known as Mrs. Elvira Griffith. Mrs. Griffith was suspected of murdering several husbands, but none of these rumors were ever proven. Kate was believed to be Elvira's 5th daughter, born Sarah Eliza Mark. She later married and was known as Sarah Eliza Davis, based on an inscription in a Bible recovered from the Bender home. It was believed that John Jr. was born John Gebhardt, although no other proof of his identity exists. Some of the Benders' neighbors claimed that John and Kate were not brother and sister, but actually husband and wife. Deaths and disappearances. In May 1871, the body of a man named Jones, who had had his skull crushed and his throat cut, was discovered in Drum Creek. The owner of the Drum Creek claim was suspected, but no action was taken. In February 1872, the bodies of two men were found who had the same injuries as Jones. By 1873, reports of missing people who had passed through the area had become so common that travelers began to avoid the trail. Downfall. In the winter of 1872, George Newton Loncourt and his infant daughter, Mary Ann, left Independence, Kansas, to resettle in Iowa but were never seen again. In the spring of 1873, Loncourt's former neighbor, Dr. William Henry York, went looking for them and questioned homesteaders along the trail. He reached Fort Scott, Kansas, and on March 9 began the return journey to Independence but never arrived home. Dr. York had two bros, Colonel Ed York living in Fort Scott, and Alexander M. York, a member of the Kansas State Senate from Independence who, in November 1872, had been instrumental in exposing United States Senator Samuel C. Pomeroy for corruption in seeking re-election through the bribing of state legislators in return for their votes. Both knew of his travel plans, and when he failed to return home, an all-out search began for the missing doctor. Colonel York, leading a company of some 50 men, questioned every traveler along the trail and visited all the area homesteads. On March 28, 1873, Colonel York arrived at the Bender Inn with a Mr. Johnson, explaining to the Benders that his brother had gone missing and asking if they had seen him. They admitted drive. York had stayed with them and suggested the possibility that he had run into trouble with Indians. Colonel York agreed that this was possible and remained for dinner. Around the same time, neighboring communities began to make accusations that the Osage community was responsible for the disappearances, and a meeting was arranged by the Osage Township in the Harmony Grove Schoolhouse. The meeting was attended by 75 locals, including Colonel York and both Pa and Jeanne Bender. After discussing the disappearances, including that of William York, the prominent doctor, for whom a search had recently been completed, it was agreed that a search warrant would be obtained to search every homestead between Big Hill Creek and Drum Creek. 3 days after the township meeting, Billy Toll was driving cattle past the Bender property when he noticed that the inn was abandoned, and the farm animals were unfed. Toll reported the fact to the township trustee, but because of inclement weather, several days lapsed before the abandonment could be investigated. The township trustee called for volunteers, and several hundred turned out to form a search party that included Colonel York. When the party arrived at the Bender Inn, they found the cabin empty of food, clothing, and personal possessions. A bad odor was noticed and traced to a trap door underneath a bed, nailed shut. After opening the trap, the empty room beneath, 6 feet deep and 7 feet square at the top by 3 feet square at the bottom, was found to have clotted blood on the floor. The stone slab floor was broken up with sledgehammers, but no bodies were found, and it was determined that the smell was from blood that had soaked into the soil. The men then physically lifted the cabin and moved it to the side so they could dig under it, but no bodies were found. They then began to probe the ground around the cabin with a metal rod, especially in the disturbed soil of the vegetable garden and orchard, where the first body was found later that evening, that of Dr. York, buried face down with his feet barely below the surface. The probing continued until midnight, with another 9 suspected grave sites marked before the men were satisfied they had found them all and retired for the night. Digging resumed the following morning. Another 8 bodies were found in 7 of the 9 suspected graves, while 1 was found in the well, along with a number of body parts. All but 1 had had their heads bashed with a hammer and their throats cut, and it was reported in newspapers that all had been indecently mutilated. The body of a young girl was found with no injuries sufficient to cause death. It was speculated that she had been strangled or buried alive. A Kansas newspaper reported that the crowd was so incensed after finding the bodies that a friend of the Benders named Brockman, who was among the onlookers, was hung from a beam in the Bender Inn until unconscious, revived and interrogated as to what he knew, then hanged again. After the 3rd hanging, they released him and he staggered home, as one who was drunken or deranged. Word of the murder spread quickly, and more than 3,000 people, including reporters from as far away as New York City and Chicago, visited the site. The Bender cabin was destroyed by souvenir hunters who took everything, including the bricks that lined the cellar and the stones lining the well. State Senator Alexander York offered a $19.992 as of 2017 reward for the Bender family's arrest. On May 17, Kansas Governor Thomas A. Osborne offered a $39.983 as of 2017 reward for the apprehension of all 4. Killing method. It is conjectured that when a guest would stay at the Benders' bed and breakfast inn, the hosts would give the guest a seat of honor at the table, which was positioned over a trapdoor that led into the cellar. With the victim's back to the curtain, Kate would distract the guest, while John Bender or his son would come from behind the curtain and strike the guest on the right side of the skull with a hammer. The victim's throat was cut by one of the women to ensure death. The body was then dropped through the trapdoor. Once in the cellar, the body would be stripped and later buried somewhere on the property, often in the orchard. Testimony from people who had stayed at the Benders Inn and had managed to escape before they could be killed appeared to support the presumed execution method of the Benders. William Pickering said that when he had refused to sit near the wagon cloth because of the stains on it, he was threatened with a knife by Kate Bender, whereupon he fled the premises. A Catholic priest claimed to have seen one of the Bender men concealing a large hammer, at which point he became uncomfortable and quickly departed. More than a dozen bullet holes were found in the roof and sides of the cabin. The media speculated that some of the victims had attempted to fight back after being hit with the hammer. Escape. Detectives following wagon tracks discovered the Benders' wagon abandoned with a starving team of horses, with one of the mares lame, just outside the city limits of Thayer, 12 miles north of the inn. It was confirmed that in Thayer the family had bought tickets on the Leavenworth, Lawrence and Galveston Railroad for Humboldt. At Chanute, John Jr. and Kate left the train and caught the MK&T train south to the terminus in Red River County near Denison, Texas. From there they traveled to an outlaw colony thought to be in the border region between Texas and New Mexico. They were not pursued, as lawmen following outlaws into this region often never returned. Several groups of vigilantes were formed to search for the Benders. Many stories say that one vigilante group actually caught the Benders and shot all of them but Kate, whom they burned alive. Another group claimed they had caught the Benders and lynched them before throwing their bodies into the Verdigris River. Yet another claimed to have killed the Benders during a gunfight and buried their bodies on the prairie. No one ever claimed the $3,000 reward, $59,975 as of 2017. However, the story of the Benders' escape spread, and the search continued on and off for the next 50 years. Often, two women traveling together were accused of being Kate Bender and her mother. In 1884, it was reported that John Flickinger had committed suicide in Lake Michigan. Whether or not John Flickinger was really Jan Bender is unknown. Arrests. Several weeks after the discovery of the bodies, Addison Roach and his son-in-law, William Buxton, were arrested as accessories. In total 12 men, of bad repute in general, would be arrested, including Brockman. All had been involved in disposing of the victims as stolen goods, with Mit Cherry, a member of the Vigilance Committee, implicated for forging a letter from one of the victims, informing the man's wife that he had arrived safely at his destination in Illinois. On October 31, 1889, it was reported that a Mrs. Elvira Monroe, aka Mrs. Elvira Griffith, and Mrs. Sarah Eliza Davis had been arrested in Niles, Michigan, often misreported as Detroit, several weeks earlier for larceny. They were released after being found not guilty, but were then immediately rearrested for the Bender murders. According to the Pittsburgh Dispatch, the daughter of one of the Bender's victims, Mrs. Frances C. McCann, had reported the pair to authorities in early October after tracking them down. Mrs. McCann's story came from dreams that she had about her father's murder, which she discussed with Sarah Eliza. The women's identities were later confirmed by two Osage Township witnesses from a tintype photograph. In mid-October, Deputy Sheriff Leroy Dick, the Osage Township trustee who had headed the search of the Bender property, arrived in Michigan and arrested the couple on October 30. Following their release on the larceny charges, Mrs. Monroe resisted, declaring that she would not be taken alive, but was subdued by local deputies. Mrs. Davis claimed that Mrs. Monroe was Ma Bender, but that she herself was not Kate, but her sister Sarah. She later signed an affidavit to that effect, while Monroe continued to deny the identification and in turn accused Sarah Eliza of being the real Kate Bender. Deputy Sheriff Dick, along with Mrs. McCann, escorted the pair to Oswego, Kansas, where 7 members of a 13-member panel confirmed the identification and committed them for trial. Another of Mrs. Monroe's daughters, Mary Garday, later provided an affidavit claiming that her mother, then Elvira Shearer, under the name of Elvira Marks, was actually serving 2 years in the Detroit House of Corrections in 1872 for the manslaughter of her daughter-in-law, Emily Mark. Records of the incarceration back up this affidavit. At her hearing, Mrs. Monroe denied any knowledge of Shearer or the manslaughter charge and remained incarcerated with her daughter. Originally scheduled for February 1890, the trial was held over to May. Mrs. Monroe now admitted she had married a Mr. Shearer in 1872 and claimed she had previously denied it as she did not want the court to know that her name was Shearer at that time and that she had a conviction for manslaughter. Their attorney also produced a marriage certificate indicating that Mrs. Davis had been married in Michigan in 1872, the time when several of the murders were committed. Eyewitness testimony was given that Mrs. Monroe was Ma Bender. Judge Calvin dismissed Mary Garday's affidavit as she was a chip off the old block. He found that other affidavits supporting Garday's were sufficient proof that the women could never be convicted, however, and he discharged them both. The affidavits and other papers are missing from the file in Labette County, so further examination is impossible. A number of researchers question the ready acceptance of the affidavit's authenticity and suggest that the county was unwilling to accept the expense of boarding the 2 women for an extended period. While the 2 women were certainly criminals and liars, as their own defense attorney admitted, the charges were weak, and many people doubted their identification as the Benders. Victims. 1869. Joe Sowers, found with a crushed skull and throat cut but not believed to be a Bender victim. The Benders did not arrive in Labette County until 1870. Winter 1871–1872. Two unidentified men found on the prairie in February 1872 with crushed skulls and throats cut. December 1872. Henry Mackenzie, relocating to Independence from Hamilton County, Indiana. $36 and a matched team of horses missing. December 1872. Johnny Boyle, from Howard County, Kansas. $10. A pacing mare, and an $850 saddle missing. Found in the Bend as well. December 1872. George Newton Longcore and his 18-month-old daughter, Mary Ann. Contemporary newspapers reported his name as either George W. Longcore or George Launcher, while Mary Ann is similarly reported as being either 8 years old or 18 months old. According to the 1870 census, George and his wife, Mary Jane, were neighbors of Charles Ingalls and family in Independence, while his wife's parents lived 2 houses away. Following the deaths of his infant son, Robert, from pneumonia in May 1871, and his 21-year-old wife, Mary Jane, née Gilmore, following the birth of Mary Ann several months later, George was likely returning to the home of his parents, Anthony and Mary Hughes Longcore, in Lee County, Iowa. In preparation for his return to Iowa, George had purchased a team of horses from his neighbor, Dr. William Henry York, who later went looking for George and was also murdered. Both were veterans of the Civil War. $900 missing. The daughter was thought to have been buried alive, but this was not proven. No injuries were found on her body, and she was fully clothed, including mittens and hood. Both were buried together in the apple orchard. Various body parts. The parts did not belong to any of the other victims found and are believed to belong to at least 3 additional victims. 1873. During the search, the bodies of 4 unidentified males were found in Drum Creek and the surrounds. All 4 had crushed skulls and throats cut. One might have been Jack Bogart, whose horse was purchased from a friend of the Benders after he went missing in 1872. By including the recovered body parts not matched to the bodies found, the finds are speculated to represent the remains of more than 20 victims, with the exception of Mackenzie and York, who were buried in Independence, the Longcores, who were buried in Montgomery County, and McCarty, who was buried in Parsons, Kansas. None of the other bodies was claimed, and they were reburied at the base of a small hill 1 mile southeast of the Benders' Orchard, one of several at the location now known as the Benders Mounds. A historical marker describing the Benders' crimes is located in the rest area at the junction of U.S. Route 400 and U.S. Route 169 north of Cherryvale. Connection to Little House on the Prairie. The Ingalls family, made famous in the books and television series Little House on the Prairie, lived near Independence, and Laura Ingalls Wilder mentioned the Bender family in her writing and speeches. In 1937 she gave a speech at a book fair, which was later transcribed and printed in the September 1978 Saturday Evening Post, and in the 1988 book A Little House Sampler. She mentioned stopping at the inn, as well as recounting the rumors of the murders spreading through their community. She alleged that her father, Pa Ingalls, joined in a vigilante hunt for the killers, and when he spoke of later searches for them she recalled, "At such times Pa always said in a strange tone of finality, 'They will never be found.' They were never found, and later I formed my own conclusions why." Quote. Appearances in media. Anthony Boucher's 1943 short story, They Bite, is set at a western oasis where carcass once used to kill and eat travelers. The hypothesis is floated that they were the Benders, who, in this telling, ate their victims. After leaving Kansas, there are still man-eating somethings at the oasis, and the hypothesis is that the Benders linked up with some sort of supernatural power in the desert and became nearly immortal. Episode 4 of the 1954 television series Stories of the Century, titled Kate Bender, focused on only the son and daughter. Candle of the Wicked, by Manly Wade Wellman, novelizes the events leading up to the discovery of the Bender killings. The Big Valley, Season 3, Episode 6, Lady Killer, loosely depicts the story of the Bloody Benders, as an innkeeper's pretty daughter is the bait used to rob and kill visitors. The inn is separated by a canvas curtain, from behind which the Bleak family kills visitors. Seated in a chair of honor, with a hammer, the father is guest star Royal Dano. The daughter is played by Marlon Mason. The Western novel The Hell Benders by Ken Hodgson focuses on the manhunt for the Benders after the discovery of their crimes. In Neil Gaiman's novel American Gods, the main character Shadow and his associates Mr. Nancy and Chernabog visit a clearing near Cherryvale, Kansas. Mr. Nancy tells Shadow that a group of people, the Benders, used to make human sacrifices to Chernabog in the clearing. Chernabog, a Russian deity, drew sustenance and power from the murders because the Benders used his chosen instrument, a hammer. The novel Cottonwood, by Scott Phillips, features Kate Bender in a supporting role. The second half of the book takes place during the trial of two alleged surviving members of the Bender family. Season 1, Episode 15 of the TV series Supernatural, titled The Benders, alludes to the historical Benders in a number of ways. Set in contemporary Hibbing, Minnesota, it features a family of thrill killers named Pa, Missy, Lee, and Jared Bender, whose downfall ultimately comes from a sheriff looking for her missing brother. In Lyle Brandt's novel Massacre Trail, the Benders are responsible for several homestead killings and are brought down by Marshal Jack Slade. In Season 1, Episode 3 of the Hulu comedy series Quick Draw, the main character, Sheriff John Henry Hoyle, and his deputy, Eli, are trapped and held hostage by the Benders. John Sr., Elvira, and Kate, while investigating a murder. Season 2, Episode 2 of the ID documentary series Evilkin concerns the Benders. Historians, authors, and the director of the Cherryvale Historical Museum are interviewed. The 8th episode of The Librarians, titled "And the Heart of Darkness," portrays the Benders as serial murderers who escaped justice by hiding in the magical house of refuge. Katie Lee Zawada, portrayed as a teenager rather than a young adult, eventually banished her own family and took possession of the house, using it to remain immortal as she tricked and murdered anyone seeking refuge. She was eventually defeated by the librarians during a missing in Slovakia and turned into dust by the house's caretaker spirit, who had come to recognize her as an evil influence. The novel Hell's Half Acre by Nicholas Nicastro retells the murder spree and imagines the origins of the characters, especially Katie Bender,